listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96, and we have just completed the Jazz Zone with T in Providence. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, who is the Moores Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, where he holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies. And his books include Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois and Race War, White Supremacy and the Japanese Attack on the British Empire. And his latest work is Armed Struggle, with a big question mark, discussing the Black Panther Party. And Dr. Horne, how are you feeling today?
Hey, it's all good.
You're feeling all right, huh?
Of course.
I guess the first question I wanted to ask you is, how do you compare William Ruto, the current head of state of Kenya, how do you compare him with Jomo Kenyatta and Dedan Kimathi and General China? What's your analysis of that, one, and then two? Could you talk about the meetings between the U.S. and Biden and Mr. Ruto?
Well, before I get into Kenya, let me say that I would recommend to our audience that they look at the front page of the New York Times. There's a new book published by a Black man by the name of John Jacobs. You may be familiar with his sister, Harriet Jacobs, wrote a famous slave narrative, which was dramatized. They were from North Carolina. John Jacobs, in the middle of the 19th century, after working as a seafarer, winds up in Australia, where he writes this book, which is about to be published by the University of Chicago Press, where he denounces not only the United States, but the Constitution, the hallowed and revered Constitution. And I mentioned that because, we have all these friends of ours on the left who keep telling us about how the creation of the United States was this great leap forward for humanity, and the Constitution, which of course, by the way, for the most part, did not apply to Black people or Native Americans, but somehow that too was a great leap forward for humanity. And now, straight from the horse's mouth, have this newly discovered book, discovered by a young scholar at Rhode Island, which tells a totally different story. And so, as I oftentimes tell people who want to argue with me, I say, your argument is not with me. Your argument is with people, Black people who lived in the 19th century and lived in the late 18th century under the tyranny and despotism of white supremacy. That's who your argument is with. Now, with regard to Kenya, I take it your question is motivated by the point that William Ruto, the leader of this East African nation, paid a state visit to Washington, which is quite unusual for African leaders to be honored by a state visit. I think the last one was maybe 15 or 16 years ago, for example. But Kenya is assuming the role of a kind of deputy sheriff for US imperialism in the region, not only with regard to sending troops in the past to Congo and to trying to get involved in the South Sudanese conflict, but also you probably know that Kenya is in the process of sending thousands of police officers to this hemisphere, to Haiti, financed and transported by US imperialism. To be fair, it's not only Kenya sending troops to the Caribbean. Apparently, Jamaica, Barbados, Bangladesh, and Chad are also involved. But this is controversial because in the past, when you've had foreign forces in the Caribbean, for example, in the last decade or so, they've been accused of spreading disease and spreading sexual abuse. I should also say that the solidarity movement, at least in the United States, is split on this question of what these Kenyan and other forces are seeking to confront. I'm speaking of the paramilitary forces, oftentimes denoted as gangs. You have one wing of the Solidarity movement who sees them as, quite frankly, proto-revolutionaries, and others see them as exploitative gangsters. But in any case, what's controversial in Kenya is sending the flower of their youth thousands of miles away when the Kenyan police have a well-merited reputation for violence when it comes to dealing with Kenyan people. And I should also say that this U.S. relationship with Kenya, it also represents a kind of settler state solidarity, because recall that Kenya was a settler state before independence in 1963. It had one of the largest European settler populations on the African continent. And what's interesting is that its assumed role as a deputy sheriff for US imperialism mirrors the role that Australia sought to play under a previous Tory government. In fact, this term deputy sheriff was not minted by myself. It was minted by a Tory leader in Canberra to describe what Australia's role was going to be. This settler solidarity, or erstwhile settler state solidarity, not only encompasses, I guess you can say, the United States and Kenya and Australia, but also to the extent that Canada is involved in this Haiti episode, you could say it involves Canada as well. And needless to say, it involves Israel, the settler state of the moment. Now, from the beginning of British colonialism in East Africa, in Kenya, you had a prominent role played by Euro-Americans. In fact, some of the richest and wealthiest nationals, individuals in Kenya were in fact of Euro-American heritage. And I think this has something to do with the fact that the British Empire, which of course was headquartered in Great Britain, a country with a contemporary population of only about 65 million, was trying to rule British India. It was trying to rule a good deal of the Caribbean and Africa. And to do that, it had to rely upon US nationals. And so if you look at my book on Kenya, the liberation struggle there, I begin the book by talking about how during the era of the so-called Mau Mau Revolt, the Land and Freedom Army Revolt, under the leadership, in a certain sense, of Didan Kamati, that U.S. nationals, just like they played a similar and similarly violent role in trying to repress Africans in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, they did something similar in Kenya. And perhaps you should not see it as coincidental that the first president of African descent in the United States, Barack Obama, of course, is of Kenyan heritage. Now, with regard to Jomo Kenyatta, he had an estimable role in the 1930s when he was in exile in London and palling around with Paul Robeson. He developed a reputation as being a kind of a popular anthropologist. But after coming to power, this after having served a term in prison, I don't think that he lived up to the expectations that many had set for him. And Kenya, under Mr. Kenyatta's rule, and certainly under the rule of Uhuru Kenyatta, his lineal descendant, has been a kind of neo-colonial satrap, so to speak. And that particular role will seemingly be continued by one William Ruto. But, of course, history has a way of sneaking up on us. Who would have imagined on October 6, 2023, that 7-8 months later, that there would be an arrest warrant out, or at least coming and pending, for Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet, that they would be dragged before the dock of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So let's not write off Kenya yet, although I'm understanding, and I understand why some might seek to do so.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and the whole question of ethnic rivalry or so-called or tribalism. Where does Kenya stand on that in terms of other spaces on the African continent?
Well, I'll respond to that, but I don't know if that's Melinda or somebody has background noise. That perhaps, Melinda, you usually go on mute, but so you may want to emulate your past practices. But in any case, one of the problems in Kenya has been ethnic conflict. For example, Mr. Obama's ancestors in Kenya were Luo. And the joke in Kenya was that you would have a Luo as president of the United States before being president of Kenya. And yeah, there is something to that. And of course, Kikuyus have had a stranglehold on political power. And to the extent that they have not, there have been other smaller ethnic groups who have been able to jump ahead, if you like, in the queue ahead of the Luos. So this is a continuing problem in Kenya. And what can I say?
The last thing on the issue. Don't you think that Kenya has had a very the revolutionary wing of people from Kenya has had a very positive role in terms of energizing Africans in the West. The Snick Singers had songs about forgot I'm having a senior moment. Ogingo Dinga and Mumi Abu Jamal has his name is from Kenya. Bobby Seals talking about reading facing Mount Kenya. Don't you think that the whole question of the Uhuru comes out of for the slogan of Uhuru is comes out of the Land and Freedom Army? Can I say that I'm right on that?
Well, I mean, certainly the so-called Mau Mau Revolt had an electrifying impact in North America. Had an electrifying impact all over the world. In fact, East Africa, not only Kenya, but of course Abyssinia, Ethiopia has had a dynamic impact on events in this hemisphere. And so certainly there's something to that. But of course, you could say the same thing about Southern Africa. You could say the same thing about West Africa. You could say the same thing about Nasser's Egypt or Ben Bella's Algeria. So yes, East Africa, Kenya has had a profound impact on events outside of that territory. But the same could be said for a number of African territories and countries.
Yeah, I can see that. Melinda, you have some questions.
Yeah, are we going to talk about Congo and the Congo coup?
Well, just a few days ago, there was a number of U.S. nationals of Congolese extraction who apparently tried to execute a coup in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, many of our friends, the Congo Solidarity Movement, they saw this attempt as something of a comic opera because it was so shambolic, so ineffectual. A number of them wound up dead on the spot. But I have to say, in my commentary and analysis, I'm taking it a bit more seriously. I'm taking it seriously because the fact of the matter is that this Congo coup reflected a number of wider trends, or attempted coup, I should say. One, of course, is the struggle for resources. Congo, as we've said more than once on this program, is a storehouse of coltan and cobalt and other mineral resources essential for the green economy. Africa is essential in that regard, and it speaks to the contestation between the People's Republic of China and the United States. And then thirdly, Africa with 4 dozen plus, 50 plus different nations, plays an outsized role at the United Nations and other multilateral bodies, when you consider that the United Nations has about, 190 different member states, and when the 50 plus African states act in a cohesive manner, they can wield influence. And so my take on this attempted coup is that it's a return to the Cold War, except it's a return to the Cold War with a vengeance. What I mean by that is that it's not enough for a government to be pro-U.S., because certainly the government of Tshisekedi in Congo can be fairly considered to be pro-U.S. But I think Washington wants the governments not only to be pro-U.S., but to be anti-China. And the Tshisekedi government cannot be seen to be anti-China. In fact, it's welcomed a Chinese investment. And that, it seems to me, underlies the coup. And just to add a footnote with regard to the struggle over resources, I'm sure you and your audience are following closely and carefully the tumultuous events in New Caledonia, about 900 kilometers off the coast of Australia, a French colony where France has sought to transform the demography by, over the decades, shipping French nationals there as settlers and then empowering them to vote, where they have blocked independence of the indigenous population, leading to tumult and turmoil, to the point where Mr. Macron flew 17,000 miles to New Caledonia just this week to try to calm things down, but I don't think he will succeed. But returning to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there's another twist in that plot that I think underscores the point that I was making. That twist being the Israeli billionaire Dan Gertler, Gertler, who plays an outsized role in the Congolese economy. The United States is upset with Dan Gertler. They're seeking to force him to sell his interests to another company or another individual. And I think it has something to do with the fact, once again, that Israel, his home country, certainly is pro-US, but Israel has sought to have positive relations with China, just like basically every nation on planet Earth. In fact, Israel has been accused of leaking sophisticated U.S. military technology to the People's Republic of China. And I think that helps to explain why Dan Gertler is now under fire. So I think you'll see a similar phenomenon work itself out in neighboring Zambia. Zambia is a repository of copper. Whenever you talk about electricity, fundamentally, you're talking about copper, and we're now in the era moving away from the internal combustion engine towards electric vehicles. And once again, copper will be essential. Zambia would be essential. And once again, Zambia is a pro-US government. It's hard to say that it is an anti-China government. And once again, this interference, or what I understand to be interference in the internal affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, is nothing new. As keen students of Congo recognize, we all know about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the early 1960s with the U.S. complicity. If you don't believe me, look at the memoir of the CIA station chief in the Congo at that time, Larry Devlin, Devlin, not Devil, but Devlin, who freely admits to CIA complicity. And even before that, in the horrendous days of the African slave trade, Congo was a happy hunting ground for these merchants of death. Speaking of slave traders, in fact, one of the few U.S. slave traders who was actually executed because of his seeking to kidnap Africans was Nathaniel Garden of the United States, who in the early days of the Abraham Lincoln administration had sought to bring scores, if not hundreds, of Congolese to work for free here in North America. And finally, Lincoln realized that by turning a blind eye to this kind of horror, he was only strengthening the so-called Confederate States of America, who was trying to overthrow his government. So Lincoln decided to make an example of Nathaniel Gordon by subjecting him to the death penalty. And so we see that the United States is becoming ever more hysterical about the role of China. You see that with regard to what we talked about concerning the Sahel, particularly Niger, but not only Niger, but also Mali, Burkina Faso as well. So stay tuned with regard to events unfolding in Africa, because with this so-called attempted coup in Congo, it may be a foretaste of more tumult to come.
And you're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. I just want to tell this brief story, but in 1961, I remember when Patrice Lumumba, Joseph Okito, and Maurice Mpolo were killed. I remember January 17th, 1961. I was on my first couple of days in high school at John C. Fremont, and there was a guy by the name of Charles Wright, who was he had his own car. He had all the women, one of the best dressed guys in the school, and he was a renegade Slauson, which was a part of Al Prentice Bunchy Carter's section of the Slausons. And I never will forget, as long as I live, he jumped up and he started making fun of, they just killed Cathay Boo Boo, Boo Cathay Boo 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 Boo, and I was couldn't figure it out. I'm just saying, why would this guy be making fun of, the Africans like that? And there was a brother from the Nation of Islam and told me, I see you're not pleased with that brother talking about Africa like that. He asked me, he said, would you like to hear the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad? I said, who? And I went to the mosque I was 14 years old, I remember. And that started at, 56 Broadway. I went to Temple 27 and heard Minister John Shabazz, a.k.a. Allah Akbar Muhammad, who was the second in command in the Nation of Islam. And with that, I want to go and ask you about the International Criminal Court in Israel. What's your take on that?
Well, apparently Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, is asking for authorization to issue an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu and other members of his war cabinet, but also leaders of Hamas, the opposition movement in Palestine, in Gaza as well. And what's interesting is that heretofore, the ICC has had a reputation for going after leaders of formerly socialist countries like Yugoslavia. And what's interesting here is that US imperialism has not welcomed this arrest warrant. On the other hand, a number of European countries are not necessarily opposed. And that's consistent with the fact that of late, you've had Spain, Ireland, and Norway attempting to issue diplomatic recognition of an emergent Palestinian state. And so you have a fracture with regard to the North Atlantic countries, with regard to Mr. Netanyahu, and with regard to Israel. And this is where a lot of analysis falls down. I mean, oftentimes this is blamed upon the political weaknesses and ideological weaknesses of one Joseph R. Biden, which I will not disagree with, but it's really more structural. It really goes back to the origins of settler colonialism in North America, whereby Protestant England, which was the scrappy underdog, when the time came to join the colonial feast, in contrast with the then leaders of the colonial feast, speaking of Spain and Portugal, the so-called Catholic powers. And so England, Protestant England, wrong-footed the Catholic powers by seeking to embrace the Jewish diaspora. And that takes place despite the fact that England had expelled its own Jewish community at the end of the 13th century. And that turned out to be the winning ticket because it allowed the Jewish diaspora to be incorporated into the halls of whiteness. And therefore, you see Zionist billionaires playing a leading role in the US political economy, wielding influence not only in the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party. And therein lies the reason why the US administration under Joseph R. Biden has been so lethargic, to use a euphemism, in terms of backing this arrest warrant for Mr. Netanyahu, not to mention Mr. Biden and his State Department excoriating the South Africans for dragging Israel into the dock at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And that is a very tough nut to crack. I think that that nut will be cracked because I think that there's a growing recognition in the US ruling class that US imperialism is suffering reputational damage to its detriment by backing this plausible case for genocide in Palestine. Not only that, but Washington is bogged down in Palestine when it wants to focus like a laser beam on China and, of course, on Russia. And so this is a looming crisis within the highest councils of the US ruling class. And that is the sort of analysis that we need, if I might say so, if we're going to take advantage of this crisis, more so than ascribing it to the real or imagined political weaknesses and debilities of one Joseph Robinette Biden.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Bar 96. Melinda, you have another question?
Yeah, let's talk about Palestine and their advance.
Well, I think I just made reference to that with regard to the fact that diplomatic recognition emerging from Spain, Ireland, Norway. Norway, of course, has a strong social democratic tradition. Ireland has a strong anti-colonial tradition going back to the struggles with London. Spain was ruled for hundreds of years by Arabs up until about 1492, coincidentally enough. And there's still substantial Arab influence in Spain, oftentimes coming across the Mediterranean from Morocco, from Algeria, etc. And so, once again, this represents a rupture in the ranks of the North Atlantic countries. And this rupture, I'm afraid to say, is going to work to the detriment of Israel and to the benefit and to the advantage of the Palestinians.
And Dr. Horne, I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No.
Don't you find it ironic that, the leader of he doesn't claim to be the leader, but a proponent of the FBA, fundamental Black American agenda, who talks all of the Afro-Yankee chauvinism, is named Tariq, and Tariq was was a big man in Spain. Don't you find that kind of comical?
Well, elaborate. I mean, I have to say, I have to sort of, I know the gentleman in question, and I've actually been to his house, and so I prefer to deflect to your commentary.
Oh, Tariq Nasheed is a filmmaker, entrepreneur, author, a Mac man. I guess he claimed to have at one time. I guess he He was a gentleman of leisure, and he's done some quite a few films. But he is basically talking, promoting tribalism, in my judgment. And you know, it was, I think I put it on my Facebook page the other day. He was talking, in the earlier days, he was talking about the unification of African people. He had gone to East Africa, I think, for the first time. He had been to West Africa, and he went to East Africa, and he was basically sounding like Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, Ahmed Ben Bella. I mean, he was talking Pan-Africanism, but now he's talking tribalism. You know, it's all the, you know, FBA, the American Negro is we are what they, as they used to say, we are the flavor. You know, everybody's we're the baddest. We can run the fastest, not hit the hardest, got the greatest music, da 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 da, and everybody else is copying us. So I guess if Tariq hears this, maybe he'll murder mouth me and give me some publicity. So that, you know, that's my take on it.
I see. Fair enough.
But you know, in terms of, well, let me say this before I close. Like, I know it was always, you're always supposed to attack someone bigger than you and hope they respond so you can get their audience, right?
That's one way to go.
No, but I'll cut you off. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to mention that the NBA playoffs, I'll conclude on that point, that it seems like it's going to be Dallas versus Boston, or Minnesota will surprise us and win 4 straight, which I tend to doubt.
I want to see Kyrie go back. I want to see Kyrie and redeem, you know, make everybody choke, make all of his critics choke, especially Stephen. Well, I'm murder mouthing all these black folks. Stephen A. Smith. I want to see him make Stephen A. eat all of his words.
Well, you may have that opportunity.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, Melinda?
No, I think we're running out of time, and we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horne.
Good luck to you.
So I guess we can go out with a little John William Coltrane and with the spiritual and